together with my colleagues tonight, Martin Weiss and Kurt Verweire. We're very happy to be with you to, well, probably share some thoughts on the turbulence that I'm sure we are all going through for the moment. So the goal of the series is really to try to put the current crisis into perspective. So more specifically, what we're going to try to do is to look into what the COVID-19 crisis may mean for our respective companies' strategies. So really looking into the impact of the crisis on our companies' strategies. But we also want to think about whether strategy might actually not also be part of the solution. And if we get to agree that strategy can also be part of the solution, then of course the question becomes, what can we concretely do with our strategies? And this is also something that we hope and we want to address through those different sessions. So this is the agenda that we have ahead of us. If I can make my, okay, this is working. So this is the agenda that we have ahead of us for the 3 sessions. And I want also to already thank you all for the questions and the input that you have provided us in preparation for the meeting. That has been very helpful for us to prepare the session. Now, I have to say as well that we have received a lot of questions. We have received a lot of inputs. So I cannot guarantee that we will address them all, and we will certainly not be able to address all the questions one by one. But we do definitely hope that you will get at least some elements of answer to your questions, either in this session, if not in one of the 2 upcoming sessions. So that's also already a warm invitation to register to the upcoming 2 sessions if you have not done so yet. So with this today, I would say we're really going to start with the heart of the matter, the crisis itself. And Martin is going to discuss some, I would say, good practices when it comes to managing a crisis. He's going also to share some tips on restructuring, because I guess we have to realize from all the news that we receive every day that unfortunately more and more companies are really faced more and more with the need to take some drastic restructuring actions. So this is also something that Martin is going to discuss today. And then Kurt is going to look more at the, I would say, strategic consequences of the crisis, but he's also going to maybe help us reflect on maybe some areas where the crisis maybe it does not have an impact on our strategy, and that might also be something important to keep in mind, that not all areas might be impacted. So this will be for today. So this is upcoming. Now, just for the other sessions on May 27, what we will do is that we will try to take a little bit more of a distance, and we're going to take a bit more of a broader perspective, looking into the broader picture of what the COVID-19 crisis may mean for businesses in general, for the global economy. And also what we're going to do is to discuss together with Leonardo Meus how looking at your external stakeholders in a different way might also help you unlocking some new opportunities linked to the current situation. And then finally, in the last session, we are going to maybe move away from the direct implications and the immediate consequences of the crisis. We are going to try to take a little bit more of a long-term perspective and look into how can we prepare our organizations in terms of strategy for, well, what some of us call the new normal, but we also have to admit that the new normal is still very much uncertain. So is there anything we can do from a strategy perspective to help us prepare for this uncertainty? So that will be for the last chat on June 8th. Now, back to today. This is our panel for today, where we will have, well, we are all 3 professors in strategy here at Vlerick, bringing a little bit of a variety of different angles and specific expertise on the topic of strategy. and maybe just a couple of facts you may be interested in. For Martin, I have to say that before joining academia, Martin has been a consultant for several years at well-known consultancy practices like Roland Berger and McKinsey. So next to the strategy expertise, he's also bringing some very useful consulting skills to the school. So that is for Martin. The rest you will discover in a moment. Kurt, I would say, is most known for the 2 best-selling books in strategy that he has authored or co-authored, Strategy Implementation and the 6 Batteries of Change. So if you have not had a chance yet, you can certainly have a look at those two books. And then myself, well, you will certainly learn more about me in the upcoming sessions because I'll be the hosting all three sessions. And so maybe just for today, a fun fact, especially for those of you joining from the US, because I've actually started my career in the US at Duke University. So as you can imagine, I did not only become a big fan of strategy, but I also was almost forced into becoming a big fan of basketball. So for the basketball fans in the room, I am one of you as well. So that's for today, the panel. We're going to talk about those turbulences and strategy implications. Now, in terms of technicalities, we have really let all the communication channels open. So as we already invited you to do so, is to activate your video. So we have a bit more of an intimate atmosphere and we can all see each other. Please use the chat box as well to share all comments and questions and input you would like to bring in the conversation. We have prepared a couple of activities that we hope you will take part in as well. And then maybe just for the mic, I would suggest that for the sake of not being annoyed by background noise, that we all put ourselves on mute for the moment. But of course, if you would like to participate more directly in the conversation, do not hesitate to unmute and just participate directly in the discussion. So now with no further ado, I want to dig into the topic of today, which is basically from crisis management to strategy. But we put a question mark at strategy because that's probably actually where we would like to start the conversation, which is by asking you, are you really busy with strategy today? So if we think about what you're busy with or what your organizations are busy with for the moment, are you more dealing with the more direct issues related to the crisis, maybe some hard restructuring decisions? Is it that takes most of your attention and time for the moment? Or are you really developing some deep strategic thinking about the current situation? And to ask you to share your view, what I would like you to do is to actually use one of the very nice features that we have in Zoom, is to stamp on the slide itself. So if you go on the top of your screen, you have a more option button. If you click on more option, underneath there you will see a button annotate, and if you click on annotate, then you will have an entire toolbar that is going to open, and there you will find the stamps. Just pick the stamp that you like most, and if I can ask you to place that stamp on the road between restructuring and strategy so that we can take a bit of the temperature of what is going on in your companies today. Is it more strategy? Is it more crisis management, restructuring? And I'm going to let you explore that for a few seconds. That's going to give us some good insight to see where you are today. Well, Martin, Kurt, I don't know what you think, but it looks like we have a bit of a variety, diversity in the room. People clearly, apparently busy with some hard restructuring, but we also have people who are really into strategy, and we have, I guess, the entire array of options in the middle. So with no further ado, Martin, Kurt, I'm going to invite you to lead us through the conversation, starting from restructuring and probably ending into strategy. So don't feel offended. I'm going to now have to erase all your contributions, and I'm going to give the floor to Martin. Martin, you're muted.
Thank you, Karine, and thank you for the introduction. And also thank you everyone for showing us a bit of a perspective where you are. And I think this is directly also linked to many of the questions we have received, because apparently we seem to be somewhere in this tension or in this kind of paradox between short-term survival mode, but also not forgetting about strategy. Some of the questions have really been into how do we manage this kind of ambiguity, because we need to manage the short term, we need to manage survival, but at the same time we want to seize opportunities, we want to grow. So I think it's a nice start for us and also to integrate this into the discussion and the way like Karine introduced it. So I'm going to take a bit more on the angle of restructuring. So how do we kind of survive this crisis? And then later on, we are going to integrate the views of what should we do now with strategy. So I think it nicely fits also showing that what we have seen on the road. So let me start by introducing this whole idea about restructuring. And therefore, I think it's crucial for us to also reflect quickly on what is crisis management. And again, also one of the questions that we have received before was a very good one, because it basically asks, what is a crisis? So I think this is extremely important also to understand before we can find solutions. Now, if you think about a crisis, let me share with you maybe the more regular view on what a crisis is and how a crisis typically develops. So if you think about different stages of corporate crises, very often we think about a crisis only happening or only being present when a company is facing bankruptcy. So you might feel you're running out of cash. You might be running out of the potential to pay your bills. And that is probably where companies directly feel like we are in the survival crisis. But if you think about how those crises or these situations typically develop, there are already quite some indications and steps before that. So before bankruptcy, we typically are in this liquidity crisis situation. But what are the consequences, or what is the factor that typically leads into that, is that companies typically come out of a profitability crisis. So we are moving away from everything when we talk about banks or financing, but it's in fact something which you directly see in your P&L. But if you think about what might happen or might have happened before you are moving into this profitability crisis, which typically is reflected in decreasing sales, drops in revenues, but also maybe an increased cost position, inefficiencies. The problem that might have occurred already before that is typically a strategic crisis. Because if you think about the kind of root cause that leads to a profitability issue, it might have been that you missed market trends. You might have missed in a certain way that customers are not happy with your products anymore. And all of that might have led to this drop in revenues. On the same time, sometimes when we are getting in more competition, where we have an erosion of margins, we might not have been very careful on the cost side. So it's just an internal issue. So we just didn't follow the trends also on efficiency, keeping up with what's happening on the inside, on competition. So that is probably already a factor we should have considered even before we are leading into profitability or also in a liquidity crisis. But if you even think a step before, there are already quite some indications of that you might end up in a strategy crisis even before you see that customers are losing. And this is something where we see that a lot of companies even face something which we call a normative crisis. So what is that? Now imagine you work in a company where you realize that there are some cultural issues. So you have this kind of, we've done this in the past, so we will not do this or change this in the future. Where you have some inefficiency in governance. So for example, you are really arguing with your governing bodies, with the owners, with different stakeholders, where any kind of new idea is really stopped. So you might not directly feel like we are missing trends in the markets, but you can already spot in these companies that it's going to be very unlikely for you to be able to respond to these changes. So So if we follow a lot of those companies that really failed into adjusting to digital elements, in moving from offline to online sales. So this is something where probably in these organizations, they had been having these ideas. People might have had these ideas, but it was not possible for the organization to jump on these ideas and execute them. So if you think about that, when we are trying to solve a crisis of a company, we can of course wait until we are in a liquidity crisis, but this is typically too late. The degrees of freedom you have when you are in a liquidity crisis are probably way less than when you would respond at early stages. So knowing that this is the typical process of a crisis, we would typically now argue, how can you start to prevent them from happening at earlier stages? But now where we are, we have Corona, and if you think about how this is impacting our company, the situation that we typically face is that a lot of companies skipped typical stages of crises. So you basically end up in a liquidity crisis, whereas you might have been at least seemingly having the right strategy. You might have been feeling like you have the right culture, forward-looking, proactive. But it turns out now suddenly with the catastrophe that's happening in the markets, with drops in sales, with customers being locked down, you simply can't sell your products anymore. And that is something which is really surprising for us sometimes to see. Because now we are talking about companies that cannot survive 2 months or 3 months without revenues, where you might wonder what has happened in these companies. And the problem now is when you want to solve the crisis which we are in, and this is also linking a bit to the tension between strategy and restructuring, what are we now trying to solve? Are we actually just working on solving this liquidity problem and then we go back to normal? Or is it that we might not really have skipped some of those stages? Do we maybe have some other problems? Did new problems arise? So it might be that some companies just face, we are in a liquidity issue right now, but with this drastic change within the markets, we might realize that our strategy is gone. So a lot of things have changed. So now if we wanted to really make our lessons from the crisis or improve the company, we would need to precisely analyze and understand what actually was the problem. And that might be something which which was circulated on LinkedIn, which is, I think, an interesting view on the whole problem we are facing. Because if you think about that very simple question, what has led the digital transformation in your company? Who was that? Was it the CEO? Is it the strategy department? Is it the IT department? And a lot of companies have to answer the question, none of those. In fact, it was COVID-19. So suddenly we are all moving to online. I mean, look at us. Now we are here having an online session on that. Typically would have invited you to our campus. So we needed to switch to online teaching in a second. Your work is changing. You're working with remote teams. So suddenly everything's changing. And we are starting to realize that a lot of companies didn't actually prepare for that. Karin introduced, I'm coming from Germany. So there was an interesting discussion here in the German market where a lot of stationary retail chains complained. So they were begging the government for subsidies because they claimed that it's unfair that all of the online retailers still make a lot of money. There are still some revenues to be generated, but they are not having an online sales stream, so it's unfair. So if you would think about that, is this really a problem caused by COVID-19? Or is it just revealing a very simple strategic problem you already had before? So we can't blame all of that, what's happening right now, on COVID. A lot of it might also be just simply reflecting and kind of escalating that we had some underlying normative or strategic issues that now become very evident. So maybe thinking about that, how did this happen in your company? And maybe let me share a little poll with you where we would be just also very interested to see how did this happen in your company? When you now face Corona or the crisis that's linked to the Corona crisis, would you say this also kind of accelerated or revealed some underlying strategic problems you had? I'm waiting a second for the results to come in. Then I'll share them with you. Let me stop here because I have about 80% of people filling it in. So what we see here is quite similar to what we were just looking at. it turns out that in about 60% of the companies, indeed, it kind of reveals something. And I think this is something which is helpful in a certain way, because now you sometimes, and this is at least if we find some positive side of the crisis, very often a crisis really makes change easier. And sometimes if we reveal that something had been wrong, now finally we might get to changing the things, or we might sometimes be a bit more active in working around that. And so if we see that, I think it's important that later on when Kurt will talk about how do we now still deal with these strategic issues, let's discuss both of them. So first of all, let's try to talk about how we can solve the directly corona and liquidity related problems to solve, and later on we can see if those strategic issues emerged, how can we solve them. So maybe if you think about how do we think about solving this crisis, and let's start to move into the direction of restructuring. I think it's important to start from where the pain points currently are. And one of them is clearly in the liquidity topic. But the interesting thing, if you now would think about how you as a company can survive this crisis, it's extremely important to start even from that simple metric. So if we would start from our cash flow statement, and if I would turn this into a very powerful management tool, it would just require us to not see that as a statement, but rather see it as a very important interdependence of those kind of a triangle which stems from our operation. And that is also where we typically see the core, the strategy, and also what we later or before saw as the profitability problem. But we should not underestimate the dependency on our investment cash flow, but also our cash flow from financing, because in the end, they all are strongly linked. So if we think about the strategic perspective, first of all, if you have a problem in strategy, probably your cash from operations will be badly affected. So cash flows from, or the sales might go down, you lose customers. But at the end, if you want to get out of that, we need to invest. So that is typically this classical cycle in strategy. How do we get out of these situations? We need to invest. You want to seize opportunities. You want to create a competitive advantage. But what you can imagine, if we are now facing a drastic drop in our operating cash flows, we know that we might need to invest, but the problem is, where do we get the money from? We will probably not be able to finance it by ourselves. So what we currently see now, we strongly lend back on the financing cash flow. But the problem and this is also a question that was raised before the webinar, so how do we integrate all of that, these different cash flows? So I would argue the cash flow statement, the cash flow perspective is crucial to survive and navigate in this crisis, because we need to balance them all. We need to seek if we can manage to get additional funding. Governments will have to jump in. We need to talk to the stakeholders, the shareholders. But the more crucial one is we need to manage the core. We need to manage that we can survive what comes out of the operational cash flow. We need to live with drastic reductions in sales. And that is something where we would have to manage. We also need to revisit our investing strategy. But I'm going to explain more in detail when I come to some levers of how we could manage that. But if you want to survive the crisis now, you should be explicit and very precise in managing this triangle, because this is the one that makes you survive the crisis, at least in the short term. Now, maybe let me share some of the findings that are linked to that triangle, but also linked to insights and lessons we learned from restructuring and also to surviving a crisis. I think what you've seen already now is cash is king. So that's a classical understanding when it comes, first of all, of course, to manage a company, but also on how to survive a crisis. But honestly speaking, cash is not the only thing, and cash is not the strongest one in here. Because this little sentence goes on, because we know when cash is king, equity is King Kong. Because it might be that we are going to run out of cash. So if we are not able to reduce our investment cash flow, if we are not able to divest, we need to rely on financing, and we need to rely on our own profit strength to create cash. And this can only be done with a strong equity position. This will allow you to finance, and this is something we can again achieve if we strengthen our own profits. So it's all again linked in there. So the challenge we will have, of course, we need liquidity. There's an interesting saying about liquidity, which basically is, liquidity is not everything. But without liquidity, everything else is nothing. So So we need to, of course, need liquidity to survive. But to survive in the long run, we need to strengthen our equity position. And that can only be done if we manage to drive back our profitability. Now, how do we do that? And to talk about that, it's important to look into the classical approach that is taken specifically in consulting firms if you want to do a restructuring or a turnaround project. And I've seen many of you pointed to that you are doing restructuring. That might mean that you might reorganize, that you rethink some cost positions. Here we are, in fact, thinking about how do we turn a company from a current situation, which might be a heavy loss situation, into a profitable situation again. So the typical process here is focusing on 3 sub-elements. The first one is you need to get real. You need to install an information base. And here, let me maybe already take a bit more of a practitioner view than an academic view, because here is really something where I need, or where you would push yourself in the organization to kind of a mindset of being honest to yourself. You need to be harsh. You need to be really strict on what is real. Maybe already as a question, I'm going to ask this a bit later. So when do you plan to go back to normal? How is your sales forecast? How is your liquidity forecast? Do you think that you'll go back to normal in fall? Because if that would be a realistic plan, then you might already make a big mistake in your restructuring. Because there you need to be very, very strict with yourself. You need to prepare for the worst. You can hope for the best, but be prepared for the worst. So be real. Have a view in sales won't come back this year. Only then can we see what is our gap in profitability, because we need to turn the company around to that. Then, once we have identified our initial situation, if we're clear about our starting point, then this is the stage where we are going to define the concept. Here you see strategy is in there again, but this is going to be, when we talk about restructuring, something very different to what Kurt will talk about. Because here it's really about this very pessimistic yet conservative but realistic view on this is what we can achieve. This might mean we will lose customers, we will have to drop products, we will have to close locations. It's probably not this more future-oriented. It's just the minimum on which we will survive. And it's important to have that, because based on that, we need to define and develop how much of profits can you generate. Because thereby we are going to establish a gap from the current situation, which might be very bad, and to one where we might end up in a situation maybe still in Corona, maybe after Corona, but one where we might be a smaller company, but this is going to be our core. And once we have identified that, and this is where then the restructuring idea comes in, we need to develop the measures of how we can close this gap. Typically, we spoke about how do we bridge this gap. So we need to derive very tangible measures that could be drastic, but that are the ones that hopefully create for us some idea to turn the company around. Once we have combined that, we can talk about financing, and then later on we have to go and implement it. Yves, there's an interesting question for you to come in here. How do you create the sense of urgency to change some things in a privately owned company with a very healthy financial situation? And that is something you are raising an important point. We need to create the sense of urgency. I think this is why it's now easier for a lot of companies facing the Corona crisis, because this is clearly sense of urgency. But honestly speaking, when you are in this company still, compared to these very heavy restructuring cases, sometimes they don't even see the sense of urgency. Sometimes I spot this when they say, oh, we go back to normal in fall. So from my restructuring angle, I would say the planning should be, it's horrible, it's not going to go back. And if you want to create the sense of urgency, sometimes when they are still doing well, it's going to be difficult. But maybe here, when you show them, you speak a lot about the financial situation, speak about the profit situation. Speak about the revenue side, and maybe use the mechanism I showed you before if the income is going to be limited. And then if you show who is the factor that's creating kind of this income, and if you see that they are heavily affected, you might create that you will be impacted in the long run. You might also share some other examples, but at the end, if you don't manage to create the sense of urgencies, a lot of those turnaround projects are a bit doomed. So it's really difficult to get the buy-in, and also thinking about the implementation phase, if sense of urgency is not created. Now,
Martin, if I can maybe just add one thing here, I think there are some nice exercises also that we sometimes do that we call kill your own business. And typically when we start this kind of exercises, we think this is going to be impossible. We cannot kill our own business if we're in a very healthy situation. And then we are struck by how easy in the end, if we really get our heads together on that, we actually can find all kinds of ways in which we could kill a healthy business. So that might also be just one practice to use for creating urgency.
It's a very good point, because in the end, what we already see here, we might go in the whole topic of leadership and stimulating to people to speak up. And Guy, you also say it's about make it non-negotiable. So yes, that might be something. So we are living in some way between leadership of pushing things through or creating the buy-in. So I would argue, if you want to have your workforce with you, if you want them all to be in the same boat, you need to create a buy-in, and you need to motivate them once with the tool Karine was explaining, or just by your leadership, and also kind of being there as a role model. Now, if you think about the measures, then maybe we can also come back on how you can kind of serve as a role model here. So when you think about those measures you have, they are strongly tied to what we find in our financials. So typically what we have here, and this is why you see in this graph, there's on the left side those things that are typical in a restructuring project, which are typically about structural adjustments. This would mean we close locations, we stop servicing countries, we stop products. So this is basically where we try to focus on what is still profitable, what is working. So there might be some decisions already where we decide on moving away from areas which might have served already as problems before, but now we have to do it. And the core typically then ends up, and it's the second part here, in efficiency measures. So we would go through every single cost position, every single investment position, and try to rethink if there's potential for us to save them. That is typically what we understand as the restructuring part. That's what's shaded in gray. There's also a bit of the perspective on the further development, the new growth. And I think this is also a bit of the tension we might now have between restructuring and strategy. Maybe let me share my view from classical restructuring projects, where you are working for companies that are at the step of not being liquid anymore, being not able to pay the bills. So it's kind of a project 2 weeks before they go bankrupt. And in there, we typically would not consider anything in the gray area, because these are companies that already heavily failed in their strategy and operations before. So it's very hard to rely and trust on those. I think now in the times we are in, and most of the companies like you described and you've seen before, probably we need to really look into that and combine it with our restructuring approach. So it's strongly depending on the severity of crisis you're in. But if you still can manage between liquidity and strategy and this development, probably also find some new ideas here. Now, let me maybe dive a bit into the efficiency measures, because I think this is also something where I can give you probably some very tangible and hands-on advice. Because the first thing we would need here, it's a simple structure we need to follow. So if we would typically in a project approach a cost-cutting project, first of all, it's all about the structure. So we would use the cost items, pretty much everything you have in your P&L. We might go through your cost centers, we might go through every account where we find the cost, and there we would touch every single position. So what you can see here, we would start by personal cost, we would go through material cost, we would challenge you if there's the other administrative expenses, and we would not leave a single cost position untouched. And this again leads back to what Guy said before. And now the question is, how hard can I be? And this is for me something where I see the companies we are currently looking at with the corona crisis, you feel they are still in somewhere, they are touching these cost positions, but the question is, how strict are they? So what we currently see is companies are trying to go on temporary unemployment, they still try to keep their people, they are cutting budgets, but if you are really in a bad situation, it's going to the next level. So you would have to lay off people, you would have to protect the core, you would have to stop investments, and that strongly depends on the degrees of freedom you still have, and also on kind of the war chest, on the equity and cash position you have, how long you can survive the crisis. But you can imagine, the worse it gets, the more strict we have to become, the more painful those decisions will be. But keep in mind here, on all of these positions, it's also coming back to our leadership perspective. We need to also live by example. We have seen, unfortunately, many restructuring projects where we had to lay off people, and then we had the CEO flying in private jets and having their own driver pick them up and to negotiate the cost-cutting measures. And this is terrible. It doesn't create any buy-in. So lead by example. You need to also start by yourself. You need to show that we are all in this together. That might not, like what Eve asked before, create the sense of urgency, but it might create a buy-in. So show by a leadership that you are also part of that. The other one, what you see here is release of funds. Of course, you need to revisit your own investment strategy and all about that. So that's a bit of a view. It's a structured one. Another one which might help you just to think about structure. It's a simple formula. So when you go through your investment plans, your CapEx, your OpEx, and you want to find some concrete measures, just simply use this formula on how you can do some cost cutting. Think about the demand. So if you don't need to spend something, so if you freeze budgets, if you cut them, demand is gone. If you still have to buy something, think about the specifications. In these times of crisis, do you still need the one product that solves all the problems? Or maybe just spec it up a bit or down a bit. Think about the quantity. Do we need to buy everything today? Maybe we can postpone some of our procurement to the next year or to a time when the time comes back where we pass the crisis. And at the end, of course, it's the price. So you need to become a powerhouse when it comes to negotiating. And that might be something in a lot of companies where we don't have the culture for cutting costs. That might be something which you don't have. And unfortunately, when you go through the situations we have, just let me show you a press statement we have just from 2 days ago. And you see that the companies are already moving a bit more to the restructuring. So it's going to be more severe. And I'm I'm kind of convinced that we're going to see more of these situations. And when you look through their stories here, what will happen is more severe cost cutting, severe layoff of people. So here Brussels Airlines trying to safeguard at least 75% of the core. So they are going to unfortunately come and have to cut costs even more severe. So there you see the measures are cut. Interesting here also you see it's trying to go for a more competitive level, which might also be an indication of, is this now really something that's new to the company, or could this have been something that they have probably solved already before? Maybe let me end my small piece here on crisis and give you maybe some leadership advice also. And here's an interesting analogy that might also nicely reflect on the crisis we have. So there was an interesting view on the leadership during the crisis, and it's a little quote here from Dr. Mike Ryan, who is an expert from the WHO on the Ebola. And he was asked in this video, which you can find on YouTube, he was asked about what is his learning from crisis managing, on how do you manage such an emergency. And he had some very interesting views, and I think we can use some of them also for our crisis situation. And he had two ideas. And the first one is where he says, in this crisis, you need to act quickly. You need to move fast. And if you try to be perfect before you move, you are going to fail anyway. So speed trumps perfection. Act quickly. So that is one thing. We need to act quick. This might also be already a bit of a lead over to Kurt when we speak about agility, or Karim. And the other one, and this is also something which is crucial, it's our greatest error that we might fear failure. So sometimes in these times we have to make tough decisions and we need to act quickly. And sometimes this might mean we need to do something where we have not the perfect thought, we might do some failure. That's in a nutshell everything I wanted to share. I know that we have some other topics, so maybe let me stop here. I think at the end, also when Kurt was speaking to you, we might have another moment if you might have some other questions. But given also the time, let me maybe move on to the next angle. So from restructuring crisis to the strategy and how we can turn it around. So Kurt, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm gonna take over. Karin, do you maybe take some questions first, or do you want me to kind of go ahead
Yeah,
immediately with the
I think you can
strategy.
go ahead, but just to remind everyone that the chat box is open, so do not hesitate to share your thoughts and questions there. We can also pick them up from the chat box. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, now let's check how I can move my slides. So that some little technical problem here. I think we'll manage. Okay, so what Martin has covered so far, I think comes close to what you see here in this figure that I borrowed from an EY survey that we've done here at Vlerick. I think you will see the word IGMO a couple of times. IGMO is a group, it's kind of a group of entrepreneurs, owners, managers that we have. We have about 150, and they gather almost in a weekly kind of online meeting. And we also ask them a couple of questions, and EY is the sponsor of that IGMO group. And so they also say, okay, we had the restructuring part, it's time to go to strategy. Now, I have to be very honest that when I looked at all the documents that many of the consulting firms have made, I still found not so many kind of practical kind of recommendations about what strategy was all about. And when I talked to managers, I felt that most of them focused really on the restructuring part, which means kind of keeping your operations up to standard, try to maintain revenues, whatever you got. So what is actually strategy? And so I used also now then that kind of survey from the IGMO members to figure out in practice, what do people see as strategy? And so one of the questions that my entrepreneurship colleagues have asked was, okay, what do you see as growth barriers for the future pre and post Corona? And what is very interesting is that I think the recruiting talent was really one of the big issues, but it turns out that, let's say, post Corona, there's hardly an issue. What are the most important issues? Well, most of them are kind of related to some strategy, insufficient fit with digital needs, increasing competition, change in market environment, creation of fiscal and regulatory barriers. These are now considered to be, well, the kind of the pain points to grow. What is interesting, we've asked about strategy. Do you have an inappropriate strategy? Do you feel that this will hinder your growth? Hardly anybody kind of mentioned this as an item. So there are strategy issues, but the strategy per se does not seem to be kind of the big problem, let's say, for growing in the future. Of course, probably many companies are not thinking about growing at this moment of time, but at least what are the growth barriers? When we ask then also about what do you do to kind of increase revenues, and let's see how this works out. I have a little bit of problems. Okay, here we go. So what are your planned actions to increase revenues? Then what we see here is that in the beginning, let's say, I think many companies, they try to, of course, focus a lot on digital sales, and that's the kind of item with the highest increase. A couple of other items are increased marketing spending, introducing new channel, maybe new products. What we see is not an issue that people will do is increase prices, but also M&As kind of get a bit lower on the priority scale. This is what you see, let's say, on average. Now, when you ask people about some individual kind of plans that they have, then you, however, see that the move to digital is definitely one of the most important things that they consider. But some of those people, and actually kind of the number 2 item is that at least some people are kind of considering mergers and acquisitions. So some of those companies are really watching out and see when they can kind of take over one of the competitors. I think that is definitely what you will see in strategy. So mainly taking the move to go more to digital, that is what we see consistently. But some of those companies are kind of thinking, okay, when we have time and when one of our competitors is really suffering hard, it's the moment to take over, or at least take their customers. A couple of other issues like product innovation. So that's what we typically see. Yeah. So when we look at it from a bit more theoretical perspective, ultimately, I think what companies need to do, and this is really kind of going back to the basics of strategy, it's about looking whom do we serve and what do we provide. let's say this example here shows that if you would be kind of this particular company, you might really consider whether you still want to offer and serve customer segment number one. Maybe we should bet more on kind of stimulating product family number three. Maybe also kind of putting a lot of more efforts into what you do for that customer segment number four. The funny thing is that many companies do not even have a clue about figures, revenue figures, profit or margin figures about product and customers. So I think that is definitely, I think, one of the basic things. And many of you know that we've developed a Vlerick strategy formulation framework. First question is, whom do we serve? The second one is, what do we provide? Well, it all boils down to those kind of basics of strategy in a way. And yes, some firms might kind of build some new ideas, build a new kind of product for one particular segment. And that's a bit the kind of agility that you will need to see as well. So my question right now that I have for you is, what are your kind of strategic moves that you are considering? And so let's have a look about what you have. Do you see the polls?
No, I don't see any polls coming up.
No, then I'm gonna continue, and then no, end polling, relaunch polling. Do you see right
Yes,
now?
no, I see.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. So I think that we have almost about 70% voted. So what we ultimately see is indeed like what we see with our entrepreneurs, managers, owners, that let's say that the acceleration of the digital transformation is really the key thing. But people will also look at mainly their product portfolio. Some might even kind of look at the new value proposition. There's a couple of people who also say we have no time to think strategically. I think then you're a bit more in the restructuring mode. So this is, let's say, what we see. Now, if you kind of look back at strategy, because ultimately there is not a lot of kind of new extra strategy stuff that you see over here. So what then do we see if we kind of look at the literature on that turbulence? And so let's have a look. On the next slide. What we see is that, and that's a research study from McKinsey, but ultimately we have also found similar studies from BCG and other consultants. We've seen that in the downturn, ultimately, well, even the kind of top performing companies have to take a dip. So at the resilient companies, you see that also there, total shareholder return goes down, but it goes down less than with the other competitors. And even, let's say, in the downturn, some of those kind of companies start already to get a bit better. And especially during recovery, that's where they take the lead. Now, if, let's say, that kind of crisis mode is over and you are kind of getting back to normal, whatever the new normal may be, I think it might be quite of interesting to also kind of reflect then, what should we do? What is it that we need to do in order really to kind of kick off? And ultimately, I think we can learn a lot from this famous boxing game, The Rumble in the Jungle, from George Foreman and Muhammad Ali. I think that kind of boxing game was kind of noticed by a guy called Don Searle, who is a professor at London Business School, and he had investigated what happened with the main previous crisis, which was the financial crisis. And ultimately, he found, and actually also kind of been reconfirmed by the studies from BCG and also this one from McKinsey, that ultimately if you want to be successful in the longer term, and I think I would urge you to think about some of those elements, I think, from the moment that you can. But what is it that we can do to become more agile? But at the same time, also, how can we build kind of absorption power? And ultimately, what can you do to build more agility? I think there's a lot of reports out there to tell you what to do, but it's ultimately being faster, see faster, decide faster, act faster. Also kind of look at your portfolio of products, but also if you have several business units, really try to figure out which one are the profitable business units, what is the future potential. And we see that if you have some kind of portfolio agility and you're really daring to shift resources from one business unit to the other, I think then that helps you really to become more agile. So there's a couple of things that you can do to build agility. Now, the more agile firms also tend to become the more profitable firms. And if you have more profits, then you also build some kind of more absorptive capabilities in a way. And ultimately what firms should do is in a way kind of be both agile and absorptive. And ultimately, I think Muhammad Ali is kind of the boxer that really kind of exhibits those two characteristics most. Let's say in the famous boxing game of the Rumble of the Jungle, Ali was really known to be a dancer, but he won the Rumble of the Jungle by building a lot of absorptive capacity. So for 7 or 8 rounds, George Foreman has been hitting on Muhammad Ali, and he has just been trained to build absorptive capacity. And then in the 9th and the 10th round, then he struck back, and ultimately that's how he got the world championship title. And then the question that you may ask is, what can we do to build our agility, but also what can we do to build our absorption? And I have here kind of a short questionnaire, and you'll get the slides from us. So that helps you then to figure out how agile, but also how absorptive you are. And I think that is what I see as the kind of the literature that might also be kind of most relevant when we have those kind of turbulent times. That is some kind of very specific strategy lessons that I've learned from the kind of literature review. Any questions on this one?
So again, everyone, you can use your mic, don't be shy. And if not, you can also use the chat box.
I think maybe we can already repeat our conclusions then.
Yep.
Just to recap what are, according to Martin and myself, the kind of the main messages. Martin, do you start?
Yes. So I think we try to boil down all of our messages into some advice for you. So we started from the crisis. We were thinking about how to manage it. First of all, get real about the causes of the crisis. Is it Corona? Is it liquidity? Or did you already have a strategic issue? If you're in this kind of restructuring situation, you need to solve your liquidity crisis and you need to protect your core. But that means you need to regain profitability. It's something where we need to talk about strategy. Again, if you are in this restructuring mode, act quick, act thorough, and be strict. So if you are taking part in that exercise, it's not something you can do with only half force. Stick in there, be strict, lead by example. But then also think about strategy, and I think this is what Kurt mentioned. So Kurt?
Yeah, then actually don't forget the basics about strategy. Check out your competitive arena, check out who are the profitable customers today, but also in the future. Check out what might be your profitable products today, but also in the future. And I think if you have some extra time, try to kind of build agility in your company, but also do not kind of shy away from building some absorptive capacity, which makes you an absorptive, agile company. So that would be kind of the advice that we would have.
Thank you very much, Kirst. Thank you very much, Martin. I will take over maybe just for some concluding remarks for this session. Let me see. No, that's not what I want to share.
Maybe Karine, there's a question coming in from Eve. First of all, thank you for the nice comments already on the approach. But there's a question coming in from Eve, and I think this is an interesting one. Should a company create a core strategy team with people from different departments to think about the future and leave other colleagues to handle the short term? I think there's a valid point in there. First of all, when you think about the future, we need all the bright minds. And I think in our third live session, and I'm already seeing Kerstin, also another colleague here in the chat, we will talk about the decision making and how to de-bias. So I think, yes, include as many people as possible, because nobody knows how the future will look like. So we need to de-bias, we need very different angles. But the other part of Eve's point is handling the short term. It's a kind of this ambidextrous approach. So it's hard to do the same things or those two things at the same time. And that is probably the biggest challenge we are facing right now. Yes, if you think about having people that negotiate, that are trying to discuss the financing, it's probably a different mindset than the ones are looking for the future. Overall, I would still say you need to act as one company. You need to closely align, but probably you might find people that are more suited for handling the tough restructuring and the cost-cutting measures. And there might be some others where are focusing more on the long run. So the idea here would be create a broader task team, create some more project teams, and allocate different project teams that within the crisis management, one will focus on the short term, saving the core, and one more on the future. So that might be a recommendation that is pretty much in line with Eve, what you recommended on separating also the tasks to different people.
Thank you, Martin. There is another one coming from Johan. Is it a good idea to have a scenario session with different future scenarios? How do you know what is the best scenario? And I guess I have to take that one.
Yeah.
Because
Go
in the
ahead,
team,
Karin.
I'm known to be the scenario person. So definitely, I would personally recommend to build different scenarios. And you're right that we never know which one is the best scenario. But for me, that's precisely the point of building those scenarios, so that no one knows what the future will bring. And it is by envisioning and allowing ourselves to imagine different potential new realities that we can then start thinking about how to best prepare our organizations for that. And by the way, we're going to come back to that topic on the last chat on June 8th.
Maybe I can already add something to this from my own experience in investment banking, where we had a lot of these kind of scenario plannings. I think at the end, one of the outcome of these scenario plannings is also to see the critical points. Yeah, that sometimes we see, okay, well, a lot of things might be completely different from what we expect, but we can then also identify the key elements to, okay, what is actually the tricky point where we have to be careful. And then we are able to figure out, okay, some elements are not that important. And in every single scenario, they will look very similar. But these and that are the core things that we have to look at. And then they are decisive whether we go for the one or the other. But as Karine said, we will discuss about it a little bit more in the third session.
Thank you, Kerstin. And maybe can I come back to a comment that I have seen here from Mohammed, was also linked back to the comment about creating a sense of urgency. And how do you do that with people who are conservative? And this is also something which really leads back to the overall culture within a company. I've seen many companies that are simply not cost conscious. So they have never been in a crisis, so always was good. And when you are suddenly now hitting that situation, it's extremely difficult to make them act. So here it's leading by example. It's having to take some deep cuts. It's also living by other example, bringing that in, and also sharing what's going on in the market. I mean, this is why I have been using this story now from Brussels Airlines, where you feel like this is a company everybody knows here in Belgium. It's very close by and it's severe. So you need to bring in these cases, and you also have to make some of these measures. So if you are leading such a team, you need to sometimes start cutting in some of the areas that are responsible for you. And these are some of the hints. But beyond that, it's cultural change. It's leading them. And sometimes if they are not on board, you sometimes have to make these decisions, and then they are simply exposed to it. I heard an interesting saying in the last few weeks, which was, when we think about solidarity, it's all nice until the moment when we have to give it. So it feels, we can always talk about it's possible, we can cut costs and we buy in. But the moment when people have to take these actions, it's tough. So the overall topic is not just a financial one, it's leadership and it's culture in the organization. And as a leader, you have to really work hard on that. And Gia, I couldn't agree more. Culture is indeed about values, it's the behavior, and it's all the integration which we need to observe and monitor.
Thank you, Martin, for the last thoughts. I really want to respect the timing here. So just want to invite you again, if you're interested, to join our upcoming sessions. And if not the upcoming sessions, you might have interest in our portfolio of online programs. If that would be the case, you will find all the information you need on our website, where we have a dedicated page for that. And then I would say that if strategy really is where your heart beats, do not hesitate to visit another page, which is where we have all our more strategy-focused programs, also, of course, on our website. And for any other thought, request, idea, do not hesitate as well to reach out to us directly. We will be very happy to continue the conversation. And with that, thank you again, everyone, for joining the session. Thank you, Kurt. Thank you, Martin, for sharing your insight. I very much look forward to seeing you again in future sessions. Thank you, everyone.